Hey guys, it's Raz. All right, so this video is now we're shifting gears in this unit 2 from kind of global climate to biodiversity because ultimately our climate determines our biomes, and the biomes are pretty much differing levels of biodiversity, and we can explore kind of what that means. So that word biodiversity, right? Bio means life, diversity means like the amount of different things, right? So it's the amount of different types of living things. And we can measure biodiversity in 3 different ways. So the kind of broadest level is ecosystem diversity. So that's like looking at a given area, the number of different habitats that are available in that area, right? So more habitats, there's going to be more biodiversity, less, there's going to be less. We can also look at species diversity. So that is within an ecosystem, so one ecosystem, how many different species do we see? So we're going to look at the number of different species, but also how balanced or evenly spread that population of species is. And then the last one is genetic diversity. So now we've gone down even smaller. So we look inside one of the species that we find, and we look at how similar or different the genes of that particular species are. So those are the 3 different levels. Okay, in any of these, sorry, my head's covering this, but in any of these, the higher the biodiversity, the higher the ecosystem or population health. Biodiversity is a good thing. The more of it we have, the more resilient an ecosystem or a species is, the better off it's going to be. So when we also talk about that species level diversity, we also are going to focus in on richness versus evenness. There's a lot of work we're going to do with this in class with our parking lot biodiversity activity that we do. But for now, know that richness, we show that with the letter R, it's the total number of different species found in an ecosystem. So if I have 10 different species of birds, that's the richness of that ecosystem. Generally, high richness is a good thing, right? It means that we probably have more quality resources and that we have the availability of those resources for living things to survive. Next one is evenness. So the evenness is how balanced those species are. For example, if we had an environment with, like, let's say an invasive species that has moved into an area, it's only been there a little bit of time, but it's already started to impact the other living things. Those living things may not have died off yet, but their populations may have drastically decreased. And that invasive species might be a really dominant species. So there's a lot of them and not a lot of other things. That would be a pretty uneven or unbalanced ecosystem. Typically, that's not something we want either. We prefer more of a balanced ecosystem. Oops. So if you're looking at these 2 communities, right? If you look at community 1 and community 2, they all have 4 species. So they all have the same species richness. Okay. But if you look at those percentages, community 1 has evenly spread, right? Community 2 seems to have a dominant species in whatever that 3rd tree is. So that's going to have different evenness. So in this case, community 1 is probably going to be a healthier ecosystem. Okay. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I think logically we understand this, right? That the more genetic diversity we have, the better off we are. The more diverse we are genetically, the better the chance that we have some random mutations in there that are going to make living things better able to survive. So going back to what we talked about with coral, right? That some coral are able to survive slightly higher temperatures. That's part of their genetic diversity. If we didn't have that level of diversity there, we could potentially lose coral forever because there wouldn't really be anything, right? So that higher genetic diversity lets them basically respond and be more resilient to a variety of different environmental stressors. Okay. So sometimes, though, with this, we have what are called bottleneck events, right? So we get an original population, something happens that drastically reduces their number, okay? It's going to, kill a whole bunch of them. The surviving population is pretty small, right? So we're going to assume that whatever kills these 2 is it's doing it indiscriminately, like it's killing everything evenly. The few surviving species that are left, that's what's going to reproduce, right? But that's a really small gene pool that you're pulling from. So the smaller the gene pool, you're going to have less genetic diversity. Less genetic diversity means that population is more vulnerable, even in the future, right? Because you're not adding in any more new genes. If you just have that one little population that's isolated, you're going to always have that low genetic diversity. And we're actually seeing that happen in a lot of our endangered species programs that are basically, taking these into zoos and helping them reproduce and trying to keep their numbers, you're dealing with such a low genetic diversity that those are always going to be vulnerable populations, even when they get back out into the world. Okay. You also kind of come along with, when you have that happen, you often have inbreeding. We have inbreeding. We have something called inbreeding depression, which is when you get these kind of rare traits pop up more frequently, because they're just kind of there. We'll leave that for now. There's an example about the panthers if you want to read it later. So basically, all of this, though, is coming back to ecosystem resilience. So how resilient is an ecosystem? What is its ability to get back to its original state after some sort of a disturbance? And generally, higher species diversity means we have higher ecosystem resilience. Okay, there's more plant species to repopulate. Your soil is going to be better anchored, better nutrient rich. That wasn't a sentence, but you know what I mean. And we're going to provide more food and habitat for the animals as they do come back. So that's helpful, right? Now, we're going to measure biodiversity in class. I'm going to skip this a little bit because we're going to use it. It looks really complicated. Don't worry. It's not. We'll be fine. All right. So you've got an FRQ to practice now, which is to describe one of the 3 levels of biodiversity that we talked about in the beginning, and to explain how high biodiversity at whichever level you picked is beneficial to an ecosystem. I'm going to keep going for a little bit because I wanted to talk to you about the theory of island biogeography. You don't have an FRQ on it. We're going to do a lab on this in class. But generally, the idea here is that when we're referring to an island, we're just referring to an isolated area. So sometimes this is like an actual island, right? Like Madagascar or whatever. But in other cases, it could be something like Central Park in New York, right? Where we have this preserved, this beautiful area, but you're surrounded by cities. So it's kind of an isolated, it's an island of, biodiversity. So we have kind of 2 general rules to this. Number 1, bigger the island, the greater ecosystem diversity. That makes sense. Greater ecosystem diversity, we get more food, we get more habitat, there's more niches, so we can have more living things, more species in that area. Number 2, islands closer to the mainland or wherever they've branched off from are going to support more species. So the reason for that, right, is colonizing organisms can move to that island quicker or easier if it's closer. And if we have more colonizing organisms, more living things moving in, we're going to have more genetic diversity in that new population. Okay. Again, we're going to do a lab that shows this in class, but we're also going to talk about how we see islands in our everyday world. So again, generally, another rule here, larger islands are going to support more species. Again, it makes sense, right? There's more ecosystem diversity. We have more places for them to be, more resources for them to get at. And we tend to have a lower extinction rate there because we have more resources for them to deal with. And there's a better chance that they're going to find a niche where they fit in. So bigger size, bigger richness. And again, there's your positive correlation there. I'm just going to skip a lot of this. So we already kind of talked about this. Again, further away, the less diverse we get. Okay. And then within islands, what's also pretty interesting is that islands have very specific pressures to adapt, right? So even though islands are close, we often will get things that have very different living things on them. An example of this would be the finches in the Galapagos Islands, right? Those all came from one single ancestor and have branched off to be a whole bunch of different species of finches on all these different islands because they all have different resources available. That's called adaptive radiation, when they start from one and then you have something that is evolving to fit its environment. So for the finches, it was typically their beaks and their body size that were changing, right? This one focuses on their beaks because their food sources were vastly different by the islands. Okay, skipping this. We don't have that one. Now, the rest of these slides, I would encourage you to look through these at some point. It's basically a review of natural selection. I'm going to assume that you remember natural selection from your biology class and that you're able to kind of go through this and remember this. We've also talked a lot about most of this. So at some point, take a peek through it. Let me know if you have any questions in class and we can go through those. Otherwise, go write your FRQ and we'll talk later.